Hey, welcome to the Vintage Vibe. So, what exactly is the fuss with this little brown box? I mean, it's so unassuming and plain that if you worked for UPS, you'd likely get it confused with any other box on your truck. Yet the mission at NAD seemed clear to upset the audio industry with something that anyone could afford and really would outperform many amplifiers 2, 3, 4 times its cost. The following around the 3020 is almost cult-like. I mean, there's even a Wikipedia page on this little amplifier. So, is the NAD 3020 all what it's cracked up to be? Stick around and we'll talk a little bit more about the amplifier, what you can expect when you do purchase a NAD 3020, how exactly it sounds, and whether or not it really is a little gem that you ought to buy. So what's the story on acquiring the 3020? Well, I'll keep it short. I was out looking for a pair of 901s when I happened to come across this little NAD amplifier. In fact, he had the little 3020 powering the 901s, and I was fascinated, one, by the clean sound of this little amp that didn't seem to want to distort, and those little flashing red lights which were almost hypnotizing. This might be the secret of the 3020. Or perhaps the secret's under here. So we removed the lid and took a peek inside this little unassuming NAD. And what did we find? Well, pretty much absolutely nothing. I mean, I wasn't really impressed to look at it inside. It had a cheap transformer, didn't really seem to have much capacitance or really high-grade parts anywhere, not very symmetrical. It kind of looked Fisher Price. But to give it a fair chance, we hooked it up to give it a listen. And a good thing we did, because after all these years, this little NAD had developed a few problems that I think are probably common with the Series 20 in general. So if you have a 3020, you'll probably relate. And if you're thinking about purchasing a 3020, these are things that you probably should expect will happen to you. It's just a matter of time. And the first thing to make note of is right here on the back of the amplifier. And again, this is part of the design. I mean, NAD consciously was building an amplifier that was low cost, budget. And as a result, they had to use budget parts. And we can see here the RCAs. And if you can kind of zero in there, kind of at the stem there of the RCA, you can see one corrosion. And that little metal stem connects down into the board. And that causes a couple problems. One, it's exposed. You can see the corrosion, oxidization, dirt, all that stuff can accumulate there, which can disturb the purity of the signal or cause contact problems. The other problem is that your RCA itself, in particular the probe end here, the male end of the RCA, it makes contact with this little probe. That is, unless the probe bends itself out of shape. And that it did on this particular NAD in a couple different places. And that became a source of intermittent signal. Look at it the wrong way and one of your channels would cut out. Now it's a relatively easy fix. A pair of needle nose pliers, maybe a slotted screwdriver, and you can gently manipulate those back in place. You can clean that contact point as well too with some deoxit, but another inherent problem of that is the way they're mounted to the board or soldered to the board. And here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. You can see kind of this circular crack around this solder point here on the circuit board. And this sort of stuff is just caused by the pressure that's put on that circuit board when you're placing the RCAs in and out or pulling them in and out, disconnecting things, moving things around. There's a lot of stress put on that circuit board because there's not a lot of support. And that becomes a source for intermittent signals as well as other gremlins. And knowing the audio gremlins had likely returned, I carefully continued to look the amplifier over. These preamp out and power amp in jumpers also can suffer from the exact same solder point failures. So too can the joints underneath the banana speaker terminals. Another point of attention is cleaning the soft clipping switch which can cause intermittent problems if it's oxidized and dirty. And because the overall age of the amplifier, capacitors are really nearing the end of their life. And these main filter capacitors you see here in the center, I was suspicious that they perhaps had been changed at one point. There was a service sticker also on the back of the amplifier that shows that somebody had done some work in here prior. And if you do have to adjust the DC or the bias on it, it's not a simple task. There are little solder bridges on the circuit board, 2 of them, that you'd have to desolder in order to adjust that. And because the amplifier seemed to respond well after the cleaning, and I wasn't seeing any DC at the speaker terminals when I tested it, we just left it as that. Cosmetically, this Series 20 was in pretty decent shape. There was a scratch here, and a little scratch there, and a few over here. Most of these amplifiers are well used, so I'm not surprised to see a few nicks here and there. The paint is a quite tough wrinkle finish, so they do age pretty decent. Well, except for one thing. The knobs and the dials on the 3020 are pretty cheap, and I believe there's a glue that was used originally to hold them in place, especially these push buttons. And the challenge is when you push them in, they tend to go flying off in different directions across your listening room. So as you switch from CD to phono, get prepared to find Waldo, because the push button is probably popped right off and is underneath your listening chair. And remember, that design was conscious. I mean, they did decide to make a low-budget amplifier that sounded great. And before we talk about the sound, let's look at a couple of the features on the NAD. I mean, there's not a hell of a lot to talk about. Between a power button and a jack for your earphones, you've got bass, treble, balance, which is nice to have. You've got 4 inputs: auxiliary, tuner, phono, and tape, as well as an audio muting switch that on this particular model was actually a stereo mono switch, kind of a funny quirk as they changed from versions to versions, and it seems that they used some of the old faceplates, and a loudness switch. One cool feature, which is very 1980s, is the volume knob, and right above it, the LEDs. And just like my review on one of the Luxmans, the 80s was a time of a little bit of glitz and glitter, and you had to have flashing LEDs somewhere. And one last feature worth noting, you can see down here at the bottom a toggle switch that is marked MC and MM. So it has a selectable phono stage in here, both for moving coil and moving magnet. And a decent little phono stage it actually is. And most importantly, how does the NAD sound? The first thing you notice, a very lush mid-range. It's pretty dynamic and got a fair amount of grunt. It'll surprise you what 20 watts can actually do. And being a high current designed amplifier, at 4 ohms it'll double that, and the amplifier is stable at 2 ohms. I mean, this little amp is the amp that could. It's not the most accurate amplifier. It's not the most articulate amplifier. But what it has, as mentioned earlier, is a fantastic mid-range. And that mid-range, that little bit of a bump there in the mid-range, really makes this amp sound bigger than it actually is. It has a surprising bottom end on it as well too. And that's what the tone controls relatively flat. I mean, it's easy to get involved or sucked into the sound of the NAD Series 20. It'll pretty much make any speakers sound pretty good. And it can really deal quite well with a difficult load. As I mentioned earlier, no problems running down to 2 ohms. And that was kind of unheard of at the time, is an amplifier to be stable like that, such an inexpensive amplifier, and being able to drive some of the most difficult speakers. Again, that mid-range and that presence in the mid-range is what that makes an amplifier sound so big and so inviting. Just like tube amplifiers, that's usually where mid-range excels, and the NAD 3020 is really no different. It's a great sounding little amplifier. This little amp has got a lot of steam. I mean, it just wants to play. No matter how high you turn it up, it seems to maintain its composure and give you plenty of dynamic snap. The mid-range is involving. It draws you right in, makes you smile. Now, for me, though, one of the true tests of time and whether or not I'm going to keep an amplifier is to live with it for a while, to listen to it for a while over extended listening periods, kind of when you get home from work and you turn on the music, or it's a Saturday morning, you turn on the music, when you're in different moods. And what I found with the NAD long term is it really, though, as good as it sounds and as accomplished it is for such a low amplifier, really wasn't a keeper for me. Now, that might sound a little contradictory. I mean, I just said this was a great sounding amplifier, probably make pretty much any speakers sound good. But what I did notice long term with the amplifier was when you critically sat down and listened to it, to me it was a little overdone in that mid range, in the bottom end. It wasn't as realistic as I like it to be. And I think maybe some of it has to do with the way it's voiced, and it probably doesn't have a very high dampening factor. That's the ability to control the backwards motion of the woofer as well too, which can lead to some inaccuracy problems. Again, admirable amplifier. It just wasn't my cup of tea in the end. What can you expect to pay for a 3020? Anywhere from about $100 to as much as $400. And I think they're going to keep on climbing in price as kind of the aura and the mystique builds around this little amplifier. Even though, again, it wasn't for me long term, I'm still going to say this is a yay or a yes for your vintage audio collection, particularly if you're looking for something on the cheap, inexpensive, that's likely going to sound pretty good with any speakers you've got. It's great for background music. It's something to play with because it doesn't cost much to play with it. It's kind of like getting a low-cost SET tube amplifier and trying it. It's one of those things that, hey, you can afford to try it if you can find one of these little guys. And if it is something you're looking to try, find one quick before the word gets out. Thanks for joining us on The Vintage Vibe.